There's a bar of soap in your bathroom right now. You trust it. Your mother did too. But it isn't legally allowed to call itself soap. Not a typo. A chemical test written into law. One a soap maker on St James's Street has passed since before Trafalgar. Most of your shelf fails it completely. What you're washing with is a syndet bar, synthetic detergent, wearing a label built to avoid one word, soap. 5 brands are about to lose your trust for good. 5 have been earning it since before your grandmother was born. Imperial Leather has been part of the British bathroom since 1938, and there's real affection for it. That distinctive red and gold box, that faintly old-fashioned floral scent that smells to a certain generation exactly like a Sunday morning before church. P.Z. Cussons built an empire on that nostalgia, and fair play to them. Nostalgia is a genuine asset. It just isn't the same thing as quality, and it's worth separating the two before you buy your next bar. Have a look at the ingredients list next time you're holding one. Sodium talawat and sodium palmate sit near the top. Animal fat and palm oil. Saponified, which at least means it's true soap in the technical sense, made through the same basic chemistry Leblanc worked out over 2 centuries ago. But further down you'll find sodium lauryl sulfate, a harsher cousin of the SLS that dermatologists have been quietly warning about for decades, included primarily because it foams generously and foams cheaply, not because it does your skin any particular favours. And then there's the word parfum, a single entry, standing in for what could be dozens of undisclosed chemical compounds, none of which you or I will ever be told about. Under UK and EU cosmetic regulation, fragrance formulations are protected as trade secrets, which sounds like a reasonable piece of commercial confidentiality until you actually think about what it means in practice. It means a manufacturer is under no obligation to tell you what's actually in that scent. Independent testing across the personal care industry has repeatedly found that synthetic fragrance blends commonly contain phthalates, plasticizing compounds linked in published research to hormone disruption and skin sensitization, particularly with the kind of daily, cumulative exposure that comes from washing with the same bar every morning for 30 years. You won't find the word phthalate on an Imperial Leather label. You're not meant to. That's rather the design of the system, not a failure of it. There's also the packaging to consider, and the box itself is doing more work than you'd think. The gold foil, the crest-like emblem, the slightly imperial typeface. None of it is accidental, and none of it tells you anything about what's inside. It's visual language borrowed from an era of genuine heritage soap making and applied to a product that, chemically, has very little in common with it, for the sort of skin that spent 60 or 70 years getting more delicate rather than less. A bar built around an undisclosed fragrance cocktail and a stripping surfactant is not the gentle, trusted choice the red box promises you. It's simply the familiar one. Those are not the same thing, however much the marketing would like them to be. Radox has spent the best part of a century positioning itself as the sensible, slightly medicinal choice. The one your father kept by the bath, the one that promised to ease tired muscles after a long day at the office or on the farm. It's owned by P.Z. Cussons as well, which tells you something rather useful about how much of the British soap shelf is actually controlled by a small handful of conglomerates, wearing entirely different faces depending on which aisle you're standing in. The herbal extracts printed proudly across the label, the eucalyptus, the rosemary, the various essential oils name-checked in the smaller print, are present in genuinely trace amounts, measured in fractions of a percent rather than anything approaching a therapeutic dose. What's actually doing the work of cleaning you, and what makes up the overwhelming bulk of the formula, is once again sodium lauryl sulfate, alongside a raft of synthetic fragrance compounds engineered specifically to produce that recognisable, spa-like smell people associate with the brand. That smell is manufactured quite deliberately in a laboratory rather than a herb garden. There's nothing wrong with that, in principle. Plenty of good products use synthetic fragrance responsibly. But it does mean the botanical imagery wrapped around the bottle is doing considerably more persuading than the actual botanicals inside it. There's also the matter of what Radox conspicuously doesn't tell you, which is often more revealing than what it does. No third-party certification, no EWG-style independent verification of the safety claims. No cruelty-free accreditation beyond the standard EU testing ban that applies, by law, to every single cosmetic sold in Britain, regardless of brand or price point. meaning it's not actually a distinguishing feature at all, however it's presented in the marketing. What you have, in essence, is a well-marketed detergent wearing a folk remedy costume, evoking the language of muscle relief and herbal tradition, while delivering chemically more or less the same experience as any other supermarket surfactant bar. Comforting, certainly. Familiar? Absolutely. Not remotely what the label quietly implies it to be. Simple has built its entire reputation, going back to the 1960s, on a single promise: no artificial perfume, no artificial colour, kind to sensitive skin. It's a genuinely clever piece of positioning, arguably one of the cleverest in the entire British personal care industry, and Unilever, who acquired the brand in the 1990s, have protected that positioning fiercely across every subsequent product line and reformulation. Here's the trouble with a promise like that. No artificial perfume is a claim that relies almost entirely on a definition the manufacturer itself gets to choose, and definitions in this industry have a habit of being drawn rather generously. Simple products still list parfum or masking fragrances on their ingredients panels, included specifically to neutralize the underlying chemical smell of the surfactants doing the actual cleaning, which is functionally, and by any ordinary use of the word, a fragrance, however lightly it's applied or however carefully it's described. And the core cleansing agent across most of the Simple range remains sodium lauryl sulfate, or a close chemical relative, which is worth sitting with for a moment, because SLS and its derivatives are precisely the ingredient that gave rise to the entire sensitive skin category of soap in the first place. It is, in other words, the very thing the brand exists to protect you from, formulated into the brand itself. There's a particular kind of quiet betrayal in a brand built entirely on the word simple, turning out to have an ingredients list that requires a working knowledge of organic chemistry to fully pass. It isn't that Simple is dishonest in any legally actionable sense. The labelling meets every regulatory requirement it needs to. It's that the entire premise of the brand, the reason a person reaches for it over anything else on the shelf, is a kind of transparency that the ingredients panel doesn't quite deliver. For the person who has bought Simple for 40 years specifically because the name promised honesty, that gap between the promise printed in large friendly letters on the front and the panel printed in small unfriendly ones on the back is worth knowing about and worth factoring in next time you're standing in the aisle. Palmolive is Colgate-Palmolive's flagship soap brand, and it's worth pausing on the name itself for a moment. A 19th century marketing invention combining palm oil and olive oil. The two ingredients the original 1898 formula was genuinely built around, back when those words on a label actually described the contents in a fairly literal way. Charmingly old-fashioned, almost entirely irrelevant to what's actually in the bottle today, more than a century and several reformulations later. Modern Palmolive body wash is a syndet formulation through and through, built around a very different chemistry to the one the name still gently evokes. Sodium lauryl sulfate serves as the primary cleanser. Cocamidopropyl betaine is added as a foam booster, a recognised if generally lower-grade skin sensitizer that shows up with some regularity in dermatological patch testing. And synthetic fragrance carries the usual undisclosed compounds behind the single word, parfum, doing exactly the same concealing work it does across most of this category. The bright, appealing colours, that distinctive green, that soft coral pink, the cheerful citrus yellow in the newer ranges, come from cosmetic-grade dyes with no functional cleansing or skincare purpose whatsoever, existing purely to make the bottle look attractive under supermarket fluorescent lighting, competing for your eye against a dozen near-identical bottles beside it. Colgate-Palmolive is the same global corporation that, in markets like the United States, held onto triclosan in certain of its product lines for years after regulators began raising serious and well-documented questions about its safety and its actual effectiveness. A pattern of prioritizing a proven, profitable formula over precaution that has a tendency to repeat itself quietly across a company's global portfolio, Britain very much included, even when the specific ingredients differ from market to market. Palmolive isn't dangerous, and nothing here suggests otherwise. It's simply a value-engineered product wearing 90 years of accumulated brand equity as a coat, and the coat, by any honest reckoning, is doing a very great deal more of the persuading than the formula underneath it ever could on its own. Dove is the single most recognised personal care brand in the country, and its entire cultural position, real beauty, gentle care, that famous quarter moisturising cream, has been built with genuine marketing brilliance over the better part of 3 decades, to the point where the brand has become something close to shorthand for gentleness itself. Here is what the label doesn't lead with, and what most of us have simply never thought to ask. The original Dove Beauty Bar is not soap. It has never been soap, under the strict, historic definition of the word. It is a syndet bar, formulated around synthetic surfactants, rather than the saponification process that has defined true soap, since long before the Napoleonic Wars, since long before Britain had a proper canal network, let alone a motorway. That 1/4 moisturising cream the adverts made so famous is, in practice, largely stearic acid, a compound derived, more often than not, from animal fat, rather than the soft botanical ingredients the soft focus advertising imagery so gently and so consistently implies. All cotton clouds and dewy skin, and never a mention of tallow. Dove's parent company, Unilever, has faced sustained scrutiny in recent years over the widening gap between its sustainability marketing and its actual, underlying formulations. The kind of scrutiny that tends to surface sooner or later when a company spends heavily on the language of purity, naturalness and ethical sourcing, while the ingredients panel underneath tells a rather more ordinary industrial story. None of this makes Dove harmful, and none of it should send anyone into a panic about a bar they've used for decades without incident. What it does is make Dove something rather less remarkable than the branding suggests. A perfectly ordinary detergent bar, extraordinarily well marketed, occupying the very top shelf of British trust, almost entirely on the strength of the advertising, rather than the formula it's actually built on. That distinction matters, even if the bar itself does you no particular harm. Now, before we get to the 5 that have actually earned their place in a British bathroom, do us a small favour. If this has been useful, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. Britain's best exists to look properly at the things that quietly built and shaped this country. Its brands, its houses, its habits, its heritage, the way they deserve to be looked at rather than skimmed over. And drop a comment telling us which of these 5 you've reached for, without ever once reading the label. We suspect it's more of you than you'd like to admit. Right, on to the 5 that are genuinely worth your money, and one of them has held a royal warrant since before your great-grandparents were born. We'll start with the most accessible entry on this list, because not every worthwhile thing needs to come from Jermyn Street, and it would be a disservice to pretend otherwise. Faith in Nature has been making soap in Yorkshire since 1974, which by the standards of this industry counts as genuinely old and genuinely trusted, having weathered 5 decades of changing fashions in personal care without ever chasing them particularly hard. The formulation is refreshingly short, and, more importantly, refreshingly legible. Plant-derived saponified oils, essential oils named specifically by their botanical source, rather than hidden behind the single catch-all word parfum. And packaging made from a minimum of 50% recycled plastic, with refill stations now appearing in independent shops and health food stores right across the country, from Cornwall to the Highlands. No sodium lauryl sulfate, no synthetic dye, no mystery fragrance concealing goodness knows what. What you smell when you open a bottle of Faith in Nature lavender, and geranium is, in fact, lavender and geranium, a genuinely unusual state of affairs in this category, where the smell on the bottle and the ingredients inside it so often turn out to be only distantly related to one another. It's available at Holland and Barrett, most independent health shops, and increasingly the bigger supermarkets as demand has grown, at a price point that sits comfortably alongside the mainstream brands you'd be walking away from rather than requiring some significant financial leap. For anyone wanting to make the switch without a specialist shopping trip or a specialist budget, this is where you begin, and it's a perfectly sensible place to stop too, if you'd rather not go further. Bronnley was founded in 1884 by Joseph Bronnley, a soap maker who developed a cold compression process that preserved the scent and quality of essential oils in a way the industrial hot process soaps of the day simply couldn't match. Whatever their manufacturers claimed, it worked, and it kept on working. Bronnley has held a royal warrant continuously since the reign of King George V, supplying soap to the royal household, which means quite plainly, and without any exaggeration, that the soap in the bathrooms of Buckingham Palace has been Bronnley's for the better part of a century, through several reigns, several wars, and every passing fashion the rest of the industry chased in between. The formula is proper triple-milled soap, made through genuine saponification, scented with essential oils rather than synthetic fragrance compounds, and finished by hand in England to this day. Triple milling, passing the soap through rollers 3 separate times, compressing and refining it further with each pass, is a slower, considerably more expensive process than modern manufacturing strictly requires, and it produces a harder, longer-lasting bar with a finer, more even, more luxurious lather than anything coming off a modern high-speed production line. It is, in the most literal and measurable sense, more soap for your money, purchased in a form that dissolves gradually over weeks, rather than vanishing down the plug hole in a fortnight the way a cheaper bar tends to. You'll find Bronnley in department stores, in a handful of high street chemists that still stock proper heritage brands, and directly through their own shop, at a price that sits well above the supermarket shelf, but comfortably below what you're about to encounter further up this list. For a first step into genuinely heritage British soap making, the kind that comes with an actual royal coat of arms on the tin, earned rather than borrowed, this is the sensible, unshowy place to land. Penhaligons began in 1870 above a barber shop in Mayfair, when a Cornish barber named William Penhaligon started blending scents for a clientele that included the royal court itself, working from little more than skill, patience, and an evident gift for smell that no amount of formal training could have manufactured on its own. That origin story is not marketing embellishment dreamed up decades later by a keen brand manager working backwards from a nice-sounding tale. It's simply what happened, documented and verifiable, and the company has spent a century and a half since carefully, deliberately, not ruining it, resisting at various points the sort of expansion and dilution that has hollowed out plenty of comparable houses. The soaps carry the same fragrances as the perfume house's celebrated scent library: Blenheim Bouquet, Bluebell, Hammam Bouquet, names that have meant something specific and consistent to English noses for well over 100 years, each one instantly recognisable to anyone who grew up around a certain kind of British household, meaning what you're buying is genuinely the same olfactory craftsmanship that goes into a bottle costing considerably more, simply transferred into the humbler, more everyday form of a bar of soap, rather than reserved exclusively for the perfume counter. The base is a proper saponified formulation, entirely free of the synthetic surfactants doing the heavy lifting in a supermarket bar, and the scent itself is composed rather than manufactured, built up, note by note, over months of trial, from real botanical and aromatic compounds by trained perfumers, rather than reverse-engineered by a flavour and fragrance conglomerate trying to hit a market research brief for maximum shelf appeal at minimum production cost. This is not an everyday purchase, and Penhaligon's has never once pretended otherwise, or dressed itself up as something more accessible than it actually is. There's no budget range, no diffusion line quietly cutting corners to capture a wider market. It's the soap you keep in the guest bathroom, or give as the sort of present that says you thought about it properly, rather than grabbing something at the till on the way in. The sort of gift that gets remembered rather than immediately forgotten. But the quality behind the price is entirely real and entirely verifiable in the ingredients themselves, rather than simply implied by the packaging or the name on the box, which, given everything we've just walked through on the other side of this list, is precisely the point worth remembering as you make your own decision. Trumpers opened its doors on Curzon Street in 1875 and has been quietly outfitting the same corner of Mayfair ever since. Barbershop upstairs, apothecary counter below, the sort of establishment that has never once needed to advertise in any conventional sense because the men who use it simply, reliably tell other men, generation after generation, father to son, in the sort of quiet word-of-mouth recommendation no marketing budget can actually buy. The soap range grew directly out of the barbershop's own practical needs, genuine shaving soaps and bath soaps formulated for a clientele that shaved daily with an actual blade, which is a considerably less forgiving test of a soap's quality than a supermarket marketing department sitting in an office nowhere near a razor will ever have to face. There is nowhere to hide a poor formulation from a straight razor and bare skin. A substandard lather simply fails, publicly and immediately, in a way a bottled body wash never has to. Sandalwood, extract of limes, coconut. These are named ingredients in name quantities on the label, not the single vague word parfum, doing quiet, undisclosed work behind the scenes, while the customer remains none the wiser. The lather is genuinely dense, genuinely long-lasting, and built through actual saponification rather than the synthetic foaming agents that chase the appearance of a good lather without ever quite delivering the substance of one. However impressive they look for the first 30 seconds in the shower, Trumpers has never chased the mass market and shows absolutely no sign of starting now. More than a century and a half in, having watched any number of competitors expand, dilute, and eventually disappear, while quietly staying exactly what it always was. What you're paying for, beyond the ingredients themselves, is a formula that has essentially not needed to change in 150 years, which is either a remarkable, one-off stroke of luck, repeated improbably across several generations of ownership, or, far more plausibly, solid evidence that they got it right the very first time and have simply had the good sense, generation after generation, not to interfere with it, since however tempting a reformulation or a rebrand might have looked on somebody's spreadsheet. And so we arrive at the oldest name on this list and, we'd argue without much hesitation and very little need for debate, the most quietly impressive of the lot. D.R. Harris has occupied the same shopfront on St. James's Street since 1790. That's before the French Revolution had finished playing out, before Nelson had fought at Trafalgar, before the word Victorian meant anything at all to anyone, because Victoria herself hadn't been born yet, let alone crowned. The pharmacy has held a royal warrant, supplying successive members of the royal family across multiple reigns and multiple centuries. And the soap-making process behind their classic bars has barely shifted in over 200 years, because there has simply never once been a compelling reason to change it. No shareholder demanding a cheaper formulation, no private equity owner looking to shave a few pence off the cost of goods. The ingredients are exactly what you'd expect from a formula this old, and reassuringly, nothing more. Saponified natural oils, genuine essential oil fragrances, sourced and named properly rather than approximated. No synthetic surfactants doing quiet chemical work behind the label. No undisclosed parfum concealing a laboratory blend nobody's ever going to explain to you, even if you ask directly at the counter. Their almond soap in particular has been made to essentially the same recipe since the shop first opened its doors in the reign of George III, using almond oil for its genuinely emollient, skin-conditioning properties, rather than for a marketing department's rough, focus-grouped idea of what almond oil ought to sound like it does on a label. This is the answer, in the end, to the question this whole video has been quietly circling since the very first line. Not which brand has the cleverest advertising, because on that measure Dove and Imperial Leather would win comfortably, and it wouldn't even be close, not by any real margin. The real question is, which brand has survived on the strength of the product alone for so long that advertising was never really the point in the first place, and never needed to be. D.R. Harris has been trusted through 9 reigns, quietly, without fanfare, without a single soft focus advert or celebrity endorsement along the way. That is not a claim dreamed up for a script to sound impressive. That is simply a fact you can verify yourself, in person, by walking into the shop on St. James's Street and asking. We began this video with a rather uncomfortable fact, that the soap in most British bathrooms isn't, legally, allowed to call itself soap. And having walked through both lists, the pattern underneath that fact becomes rather clear. The brands worth avoiding aren't lying to you. Exactly. They're simply relying on you never turning the bottle around, on the nostalgia of a red and gold box, or the promise of a word like simple, doing the persuading so the ingredients panel never has to. That is not illegal. It is, in its own way, rather brilliant marketing. It simply isn't honesty. The brands worth your money have nothing to hide because they've never needed anything but the formula itself to make their case. Ask D.R. Harris what's in the almond soap, and they will tell you, in detail, because the answer has been the same since before Britain had a proper Prime Minister. That is the actual difference between these two lists. Not the price, not the packaging, whether the product can survive being fully explained to you. If this has changed what's sitting in your bathroom cabinet, even slightly, that's genuinely the whole point of making it. Britain's best exists because the things that quietly built this country, its shops, its habits, its 200-year-old formulas that nobody thought to change because they were already right, deserve to be taken seriously rather than skimmed past on a supermarket shelf. If you're new here, subscribe and tap that notification bell, because we go looking for exactly this sort of thing every single week. The quiet, well-made, unfashionably honest corners of British life that are still, remarkably, right where they've always been. And do leave us a comment. Tell us which of these 5 you've been loyal to without ever once checking why. Or better still, tell us which one you're switching to. That conversation, more than anything else, is why we do this. We'll see you in the next one.